The courthouse doors swung open and the people filed in. The gallery buzzed with low conversations. Neighbors, reporters, strangers, all drawn here by the same reason: to see if a 17-year-old boy would survive a system stacked against him. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and old paper, but beneath it lingered something else: anticipation. Every cough, every shuffle of a chair, carried a nervous weight. The creak of the benches echoed like warnings. Judge Grayson entered, his robe flowing like a shadow. His presence silenced the room. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the gallery with sharp eyes that demanded respect and obedience. At the defense table sat Jalen Dawson, a boy who looked younger than his years. His hands rested on the polished wood, steady but tight. The hum of voices around him made him appear smaller, yet something in his eyes suggested there was more beneath the surface. The trial was about to begin. Carrington, the prosecutor, sat confidently at his table. He barely looked at Jalen, as though the boy wasn't worth his time. His fingers tapped the handle of his briefcase, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had seen cases like this before. To him, Jalen was already guilty. Across the room, Jalen's eyes flicked up, just once, meeting Carrington's. That single glance carried an entire war. Carrington's smirk faltered. Judge Grayson noticed. He leaned forward slightly, intrigued. He had expected fear, trembling, maybe even tears from the defendant. Instead, he saw something sharper, something unreadable. The room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that only comes before a storm. Everyone could feel it. Something about this trial was going to be different. The courtroom belonged to Carrington the moment he stood up. His shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step deliberate, each pause calculated. He turned to face the jury, his voice smooth, powerful, and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was apprehended inside a stolen Audi A6. He tried to flee. His fingerprints were on the steering wheel. The facts," he tapped the podium for emphasis, "are undeniable." The jurors leaned in, their eyes following his every gesture. The gallery whispered, heads nodding as if the trial were already over. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying Jalen. He wanted to see the panic, the sweat, the tremble of a guilty boy. But Jalen remained still. Carrington prowled the courtroom like a hunter certain of his kill. For the prosecution, this wasn't just another case. It was an easy victory, one he was ready to savor. At the defense table, Lisa Thornton, the public defender, rose hesitantly. Her papers shook slightly as she prepared to speak. But before a single word left her mouth, Jalen touched her arm. "Come." Control. A signal that changed everything. He stood, straight-backed, voice steady. "I'll be representing myself," he said. The room froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the murmurs spread, shocked gasps, whispers of disbelief. Judge Grayson narrowed his eyes. "You'll what?" "I'll be defending myself," Jalen repeated, his tone sharper this time. Carrington chuckled under his breath. "This ought to be fun," he muttered. But when Jalen's gaze swept across the jury, then landed back on Carrington, the laughter didn't feel so certain anymore. There was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. The balance of the room shifted. The boy was no longer just a defendant. He had become something more. Carrington's voice cut through the silence as he gestured for the first officer to take the stand. The bailiff swore him in, and the uniformed man settled into the witness chair. "Officer Daniels," Carrington began smoothly, "tell the jury what happened on the night of March 14th. The officer's words were crisp, rehearsed, drilled into memory. "We received a call about a stolen Audi A6. I spotted the vehicle near 5th and Main. When I activated my siren, the suspect accelerated. After a short pursuit, the car came to a stop. The defendant," Daniels pointed across the room, straight at Jalen, "was in the driver's seat." The jury scribbled notes. A few nodded solemnly. To them it sounded airtight. Carrington paced before them like a maestro leading a symphony. "And were the defendant's fingerprints found on the wheel?" "Yes, sir." "Clear as day." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Carrington smiled to himself. He had them exactly where he wanted them. When it was Jalen's turn, he rose slowly, the room holding its breath. No lawyer to guide him. No notes. Just a teenager facing a trained officer. "Officer Daniels," Jalen said calmly, "you claim you saw me driving the Audi?" "Yes." Jalen tilted his head. "At night. During a chase. With flashing lights in your eyes. From how far away?" The officer hesitated just for a fraction of a second. The pause was small, but Jalen caught it, and so did the jury. "And those fingerprints you mentioned," Jalen pressed, his voice sharper now, "did you test if they matched anyone else? Or just assumed they were mine?" Carrington shifted uncomfortably at the prosecution's table. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The jurors exchanged looks. For the first time, doubt flickered across their faces. The perfect story wasn't sounding so perfect anymore. And Jalen, calm, precise, unshaken, was the one pulling at the threads. The courtroom was quieter now. The jury, once so sure of the story painted by the prosecution, shifted in their seats. Some avoided Carrington's gaze. Others leaned toward each other, whispering softly. It wasn't that the officer's testimony had crumbled, but Jalen's questions had poked holes no one expected. And once a crack appears, the whole wall feels less steady. Carrington tried to reclaim the momentum, slamming down a stack of reports. "The evidence is overwhelming," he reminded them. His voice boomed with authority, but something in his tone betrayed frustration. He was no longer as untouchable as he seemed. Judge Grayson watched carefully. He had seen juries sway before, had seen certainty turn to hesitation. And here, in this courtroom, a teenager without a lawyer was forcing the system to look uncertain. The shadows of doubt had begun to stretch across the room. Jalen rose again. This time he didn't ask a question. He addressed the jury directly, his voice firm but measured. "You've heard what they say I did. You've heard their version. But let me ask you something. If the evidence is as strong as they claim, why does it fall apart the moment you look closer?" He walked slowly, carefully, almost like Carrington had earlier. But Jalen wasn't performing. He was pleading, reasoning, making the jury see him not as a criminal but as a human being. 17 years old, he said softly. "That's how old I am. And yet they look at me and see a thief, a suspect, a guilty man. What? Because I'm a boy from the wrong block? Because I don't have money for a lawyer? Or is it something else?" The words hung heavy. A few jurors lowered their eyes. The gallery shifted uneasily. Even Grayson leaned forward, lips pressed tight. Carrington tried to object, but the damage was done. The boy's voice had pierced the courtroom like a blade. The courtroom lights seemed harsher now, every shadow stretched long. The prosecution called its next witness, a shopkeeper who claimed to have seen Jalen near the crime scene. At first, the man spoke confidently, describing what he remembered. But when Jalen stood, the calm mask returned to his face. "You say you saw me that night," Jalen began, his voice steady. "What was I wearing?" The man hesitated. He glanced at Carrington, who nodded sharply, urging him on. "A hoodie. Dark. Maybe black." Jalen tilted his head. "Maybe black." He took a slow step closer. "Sir, the police report says you told them it was red. And the security footage shows the suspect in blue. Which is it?" The courtroom rippled with murmurs. The shopkeeper stammered, sweat shining under the lights. For the first time, the jury didn't look at Jalen with suspicion. They looked at the witness. Carrington shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was no longer a boy on trial. It was the truth itself being questioned. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, trying to keep control of the room. "Order. Let's proceed." But even his stern tone couldn't erase what had just happened. Jalen stepped back, his eyes locked on the jury. He didn't need to say much more. The contradiction had spoken louder than any speech. Carrington scrambled to repair the damage, redirecting the witness, trying to remind the jury of the prosecution's narrative. But the man's shaken voice betrayed him, every word dripping with uncertainty. The jury wasn't blind. They were beginning to see it. This case wasn't ironclad. One juror, an older woman, scribbled furiously in her notebook. Another, a younger man, leaned back with his arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The momentum was no longer in Carrington's favor. For the first time, Jalen felt it too. A turning point. The case was no longer moving against him, it was moving with him. The air in the courtroom grew heavier. Carrington rose slowly, adjusting his jacket with deliberate precision. His expression was sharp, like a blade waiting to strike. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice dripping with authority, "don't be fooled by theatrics. This boy isn't a lawyer. He's a suspect. And what you just witnessed wasn't truth, it was a trick." He stalked across the floor, every step echoing. He seizes on contradictions, little gaps, and tries to make you doubt the bigger picture. But let me remind you, evidence doesn't lie. And the evidence ties him to the crime. He slammed a folder onto the table, photos spilling out, blurry surveillance shots, bagged evidence, police reports. The jury stiffened, startled by the sudden aggression. Carrington's eyes cut toward Jalen, cold and unrelenting. "You can play games with words, boy. But this isn't a game. It's justice." The power he carried threatened to drown the fragile hope Jalen had sparked. Carrington wasted no time. He turned back to the witness stand, summoning another officer to the front. This one was seasoned, confident, with medals gleaming on his uniform. "Tell this court exactly what you saw," Carrington ordered. The officer nodded firmly. His testimony was precise, practiced, the kind of account juries trusted. Dates, times, places, all lined up neatly, painting Jalen as guilty beyond question. And then Carrington struck at Jalen directly. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, this child isn't dismantling evidence. He's distracting you. He wants you to focus on shadows so you forget the truth shining in plain sight." The prosecutor's voice thundered, shaking the silence. He pointed straight at Jalen. "This is not a defender of justice. He is the accused. And he stands here because the law says he belongs here." The gallery murmured, divided. Some nodded with Carrington, others frowned, unsettled. Jalen felt the weight of every eye on him. The tide that had begun to turn was now crashing back against his fragile defense. Carrington had struck back with fire, and for a moment, it looked like the boy might be consumed. The trial had dragged deep into the afternoon. The gallery was restless, a sea of whispers and shifting bodies. Yet in one shadowed corner, an older woman leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Jalen. She had been silent until now, but suddenly she murmured to the person beside her, loud enough for the row to hear. "That boy. I know his face. He wasn't there that night. He was with me." The words slipped into the courtroom like a spark. Heads turned. The murmur grew. Carrington snapped his gaze toward the disruption. "Order. Order in the court." Judge Grayson barked, gavel slamming. But the damage was done, the idea was planted. Someone outside the official witness list had just thrown a stone into Carrington's perfectly controlled river. The jury glanced between the gallery and the defendant, eyes narrowing with curiosity. Could this mean everything they'd heard so far was incomplete? Jalen sat frozen, his heart hammering. Whoever that woman was, she had just cracked open a door he thought would stay locked forever. During a recess, Jalen combed through the papers Carrington had dumped earlier. His fingers brushed over receipts, timestamps, and then, something strange. A police report with two versions. One claimed he had been identified at the scene. The other, buried deeper in the stack, listed him as not observed by the same officer. His eyes widened. This wasn't just sloppy paperwork, it was a contradiction big enough to shake the case. When court resumed, Jalen stood, holding the paper aloft. His voice was steady, but his pulse raced. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution wants you to believe I was there that night. But their own reports can't agree. Which story do you believe? The one that condemns me or the one that clears me?" Carrington's jaw tightened, his eyes like knives. He knew what this meant. The truth was no longer buried. It was clawing its way out. For the first time, the courtroom felt less like a cage, and more like a battlefield where Jalen had just landed a strike of his own. Carrington rose with the same crisp confidence he always wore, but this time, his words stumbled. He tried to brush off the contradictory police reports as clerical errors, waving his hand as if the details didn't matter. But the jury wasn't buying it. Their eyes tracked him, suspicious now, less convinced with every word. His forehead glistened with sweat under the fluorescent lights. For the first time, the prosecutor who had always looked untouchable seemed human, frail even. Jalen didn't move. He didn't need to. Carrington was unraveling on his own. Every gesture was too sharp, every defense too frantic. Judge Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. He saw it too. The balance of power in the courtroom was shifting, rapidly. Carrington's voice cracked as he called for another recess, something he hadn't needed until now. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through his notes. The gallery murmured. They sensed it. The once untouchable man was cracking under pressure. Jalen leaned back in his chair, his calmness a mirror to Carrington's chaos. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply waited. Because he knew the courtroom wasn't watching Carrington's case anymore. They were watching Carrington himself. When the judge granted a short recess, Carrington all but fled to his table, his shoulders slumped, his tie pulled loose. His mask of control had slipped and everyone had seen it. For the first time since this trial began, Jalen wasn't the one on trial. Carrington was. The courtroom was silent when Jalen stood again, a paper in his hand. His voice was calm, but every word landed with weight. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence the original statement from the vehicle's owner. Carrington's head shot up, his face tightening. Jalen read aloud. I left my car running at the gas station. A kid jumped in and drove off. He was white. Not the one you arrested. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Jurors leaned forward in their seats. Even Judge Grayson blinked, taken aback. Carrington's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He shuffled papers as though looking for a lifeline that wasn't there. The courtroom energy shifted. The jury no longer saw a defendant. They saw a young man exposing the cracks in a broken case. Carrington scrambled, his voice rising. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught. But Jalen's voice cut clean through the noise. No. I was blocks away when I was arrested. No car. No chase. Just assumptions. And bias. The room froze. For the first time, even Judge Grayson looked reflective. He tapped his gavel once. Enough. His voice was low, deliberate. The jury shifted in anticipation. Then came the words no one expected. Case dismissed. The gallery erupted. Some in outrage, some in relief. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing. Jalen stood motionless, letting the moment sink in. Judge Grayson leaned forward, eyes fixed on him. Mr. Dawson, you should consider law school. And with that, the boy who walked in as a defendant left as something far greater. A symbol of what happens when truth outmaneuvers power. The heavy courthouse doors opened, and Jalen stepped into the blinding afternoon sun. For a moment, the noise inside, the gavel, the shouts, Carrington's anger, fell away. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Reporters surged forward, microphones outstretched. Cameras clicked in rapid fire. Jalen, how does it feel? Do you think this changes the system? Was justice served today? Jalen didn't answer right away. He looked around at the flashing bulbs, the strangers with notebooks, the people chanting his name. For the first time, he realized his story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone watching. And somewhere in the background, his mother wiped her eyes, her relief carrying more weight than any headline. Later, when the crowd had thinned, Jalen stood quietly on the courthouse steps. His voice, steady but weary, carried into the warm air. They called me a criminal before they called me a kid. They tried to bury me under lies. But the truth doesn't need power to stand. It just needs to be spoken. He paused, scanning the faces still lingering. Some were strangers. Some were supporters. And some were people who had once doubted him. But remember, he said, this isn't just about me. This is about every kid who doesn't get heard. Every case where justice bends under pressure. If one voice can flip a courtroom, imagine what all of us can do together. The camera flashbulbs dimmed. The sun began to set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps. And in that moment, Jalen Dawson wasn't just a defendant. He was a survivor, a challenger, a spark. The case was over, but the story had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Let's grow this channel together.